finished off the 15th chapter. We finished it off last week. I think we might just go over it one more time next week. Might just go over it one more time. Full darshan? Okay. Just going in the wrong direction. I think we'll just go over this section one more time, starting with the 15th text, or the 15th chapter. Sarvasya cha aham hridi sanivishtaha. I've entered into the hearts of all. Mata smritir jnanam apohanam cha. From me comes remembrance, knowledge, and forgetfulness. Vedes cha sarver ahameva vedyaha. By all the Vedas, I am to be known. Vedai, by the Vedas, vedyaha, I'm to be known. Vedanta krit, I made Veda. Vedavit, I know Veda. Eva chaham, I also know this. I also am this. So, this verse connects Krishna to the older Vedic tradition that he was part of. Jesus was a Jew. Jesus would have spoken Hebrew as well as Aramaic. He would have been bar mitzvahed. He would have memorized portions of the Torah. He quotes from the Torah in the New Testament. He'll quote the Torah. He worships at synagogues. He went to synagogues. He made trouble. He was a bit of an agitator. But he went to synagogues. He looked like a Jew, walked like a Jew, talked like a Jew, knew Hebrew, spoke Aramaic, knew the Torah, followed the rules of the Torah, was identified as being a Nazarene Jew from Nazareth, and also was identified as being an Essene Jew because Essene means bather, and so he was initiated by being baptized by John the Baptist. If you read the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, he was baptized in a river by John the Baptist, which was an Essene practice. So Jesus was either an Essene Jew, an esoteric Jew, or he was a Nazarene Jew, also a cult of vegetarian Jews. And so he, although he was an esoteric Jew, and they did exist at that time, there's the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in Qumran, about 80 years ago, something like that. They attested to various esoteric cults of Judaism that existed in the centuries prior to Jesus and at the time Jesus appeared. So there were esoteric Jews that were vegetarian, that took a ceremonial bath and took initiation through the process of baptism, that stopped killing animals and slaughtering animals. They were vegetarian, and they understood the Torah in a particular way. And they were a subset of legitimate Jews. So when Jesus appeared, he didn't just say, in the beginning, I made the world, something like that. It wasn't like a beginning text. The Jewish text is a beginning text. Starts with Genesis at the beginning. Like everything's in just for the first time. But in the New Testament, they regularly reference, the book of Ezekiel, the book of Jeremiah. They reference different players from the time of Abraham and Moses. There was Mosaic law, that's Judaism, it's the laws of Moses. There were the principles of, all the 613 mitzvahs. They're listed in texts like Deuteronomy. Leviticus. A lot of those were followed. Even the statement, my Father has 10 commandments, I only have 2, is an evolution from the 10 commandments in the book of Exodus, I believe. And then Jesus is trying to distill them. Say there's 2 of them which are more important than all 10. They include the other ones. So there's just no way to get around it. The Jewishness of Jesus is all over the place. And any serious study of the New Testament. Also, so many arguments about life aren't made in the New Testament. It's like an addendum. That's why a serious Bible is the New Testament and the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the Torah. Not the entire thing, but the majority of it. That's what the Old Testament is. It's a companion book. The New Testament becomes an addendum. It becomes a part 2. It becomes a kind of a redux type thing. But it's not a whole thing. It's meant to be affixed to the pre-existing tradition. Now, Islam is not like that. Islam is not like that. They make reference to Abraham and the Abrahamic tradition, and they're the third wave, and that's the best wave. But they're killing Jews and Christians, by the village, and they've got a complete text and a complete culture and a whole thing. They do make reference to like the Archangel Michael, and they say Jerusalem's also their holy place, and they say that the Christians got it wrong with the Father, Son, Holy Ghost. They became polytheists, and they say Jesus didn't really die on the cross. They do reinvent a number of staples of Christianity and Judaism in Islam, and they have like their version of things. But their version of things isn't really based on the pre-existing texts. It's just, in a lot of ways, it's like free advertising. A bit of cultural appropriation was going on. A bit of co-opting. They weren't really... it's like if somebody's pro-choice, which is a euphemistic way to say you are in favor of women being able to choose to get abortions. So you say, I'm pro-choice. So then somebody who's pro-life, which means they're not interested in women having the right to abortions. They think that the baby has rights, even though it's not born yet. So a pro-life person would say to a pro-choice, they go, I'm pro-choice. And then they go, what about the choice of the baby? Zing. Like, walk away. You follow? Or the pro-choice person would be like, what about the life of the mother? Zing. And like, walk away. It's not really a substantial argument. There's not a whole lot to it. You're borrowing a little bit of the language of the person who's making their case, and then you're running with it to try and just quickly make your case. It's a zinger, it's a one-liner, it's not serious philosophy. It might have its place in a debate or in the court of public opinion or something like that, but there's not a whole lot to it, and it doesn't really demonstrate a serious knowledge of the other party's position. When you look at Islam's treatment of Christianity and Judaism, you find there's not a whole lot of depth to their understanding of these traditions. They got, they know Michael's there, and they got some angel stuff going on, and mixed with their genie stuff, and they got a few bells and whistles. Like I said, Jerusalem. They sacked Jerusalem and made it a Muslim holy place. That's why Jerusalem is such a hotbed. They did the same thing in Ayodhya, which is Ram's place. They built a mosque there in '92. I was in India when it happened. The Hindus who had their holy place torn down and a mosque was built on top of it a few centuries prior finally got riled up because it's Ram's place, and they sacked the mosque and then wanted to reestablish the original temple of Ram because that was a Muslim thing. they would tear down your holy place and build a mosque on top of it. If you look at Istanbul and like the Blue Mosque and all this stuff, it's like it's all built on top of the ruins of pre-existing Christian places, because Constantinople was a huge Christian place. It just became a huge Muslim place, but that's because the Muslims just sacked all the Christian stuff. And they would, they get really nasty with Hinduism. They break the deities and grind them up and then put them in the steps to lead up to the mosque. People would be stepping on the deity when they walked into the Muslim temple, because they were iconoclasts, and they were against idol worship. Of course, they bow down to a black rock in Mecca 5 times a day. So, and the goal of their life is to go to that place and walk around the rock. It's like a big Shiva linga. They have to bow down to 5 times a day, and then they walk around 1 time in their life. And so, for people who are against idol worship, they have like monster idol worship going on. But anyway, like, you got to be kidding me. You know what I mean? It's like the icons of your religion become the idols of another, And the idols that you think are idols, they're really icons for that person. All that elaborate tapestry with verses from the Quran on it, that's all idols too. They put those tapestries up, they venerate them, they care for them really nicely. It's a whole like science you study. That's iconography. And so that gets called idol worship. The cross you wear as a talisman. I mean, it's like, what are you going to do? Like, you got to lecture under a tree, then the tree becomes an idol. It's like no matter what you do, eventually once you ritualize it, that thing becomes idolatrous. Anyway, so the idol is just a cheap term, which basically means I don't approve of your iconography and your ritual. But if you look at Christianity, you'll see a lot of connections to Judaism. There's lip service with Islam, and that's fine. I mean, it's whatever. It's a good promotional campaign. He's trying to convert people. So he's taking the religions which were popular at that time and saying, hey, I got the 3.0 version. And really, that's what Christianity became. It became the 2.0 version of Judaism. And I mean, Judaism, it's like nothing. It's like 13 million Jews. They don't even exist. That's like a drop in the bucket. It's 150 Muslims to every Jew on the planet. And their religion's, 1,000 years older. But maybe 1,500 years older. But yet you've got these, 150 Muslims to every Jew, and 200 Christians to every Jew. More, 220, something like that. So, Krishna did not speak in a vacuum. There was a full Vedic culture already in play, and Krishna freely references it, quotes texts from other Vedic texts in the Gita, comments on things that were not so well understood or were somewhat enigmatic, like, it's like in the Vedas, in the Upanishads, it's Tat Brahman. Brahman is that. Brahman is it. Brahman is described as a that or an it. In the Gita, that same Brahman is described as mama, mam, aham, I, me, and mine. It's mama, it's my Brahman. It's mam, it's me, it's aham, it's I am Brahman. Brahmanaha hi pratishtam, I'm the source of Brahman. Param Brahman, I'm the supreme Brahman. And so there's a move from a less personal, more philosophical deity to a more concrete, personal, loving deity. In the Gita, there's a move towards a more personal, devotional way of relating to the deity. You find that in the Upanishads and in the earlier Vedic literature, but it's not explicated with the same degree of certitude and redundancy and obviousness and plainness in the old Veda as you see it explained in the Gita Upanishad. So there's moves, but the moves are made pretty respectfully, Hinduism is the oldest continually practiced religion in the world because we didn't do what the Muslims did, which was make a whole new religion and then just give a little bit of lip service to try and popularize ourselves while we're killing Christians and Jews, by the bucketful. Not that Christians are any strangers to extreme violence. It's not like the Muslims are like the bad guys. They're following in the footsteps of the Christians who just were also wreaked havoc on the world. Although the Muslim occupation of India was the greatest genocide in the history of the world. I was just talking to somebody today and they were like, it wasn't the Muslim occupation of India, it was the Persian occupation of India. And I'm like, no, it wasn't. Like, first of all, Persia's Iran. Iran was not a major player in the game. The Persian Empire got ripped apart before Christ, several centuries. There was a few other iterations of it, and the last one got ripped apart by Muhammad himself in the middle of the 7th century. So it's like by the time Islam rolled into India, the Persian Empire had been decimated by the Muslims who took over and then went to India and established a sultanate, a caliphate. They established all this stuff to convert people to Islam. They enforced Sharia law. They made the Hindus pay a jizya. They weren't real Muslims. Yeah, well, they sure looked a lot like Muslims and talked a lot like Muslims and quoted from the Quran, established Sharia law, and did all the stuff Muhammad was supposed to do. Well, and Muhammad also was a warlord who went from city to city and sacked the cities and established Sharia law. So sure seems like they were doing like what Muhammad had told them to do. Do you guys follow this? I'm like, I don't want to talk to you anymore. I send my Wikipedia entry. It's like, here it is. I'm like, see, it's not Persian. It's like, there's no, like if you Google Persian occupation of India, nothing comes up. You Google Muslim occupation and all of a sudden Muslim invasion, the first one that comes up is India. They killed 100 million Hindus over 1,000 years. Worst genocide in the history of the world. Mao's killed 20 million people. Another 20 million died from his Great Leap Forward, which was a failed experiment in farming. That's 40 for Mao. But I don't even know if you get to count all 40 because, blowing it because of not planting the right crops isn't genocide. It's just bad agricultural management with serious repercussions. So, maybe Mao gets 20. Stalin gets 20. That's 40. Hitler gets 10. That's 50. Worst genocides in the history of the world. And then double them. And that's Islam. It was a slow burn. Took place over a long period of time. But it did take place nonetheless. And I'm sure the people who died don't feel like, it took us a long... So like our people were getting killed for 1,000 years, so it's not that big of a deal. I'm sure they don't feel like that. Also, this person is now in the same category as Holocaust deniers and slavery deniers. Now they're Muslim occupation of India deniers. So, this person was trying to be woke and make some argument, make some radical left, or not even radical, just sort of mainstream left-wing argument, until the fact that they were a Muslim got broached, and then all of a sudden they were Holocaust deniers. But infinitely worse, because 6 million Jews got killed in the Holocaust, and so you got to multiply that by 16. So they're like a capital. You know what I mean? However you want to do it. It's like they got a Holocaust denier tattooed on their forehead, trying to deny the Muslim Islamic occupation of India. So, not like that, where Islam just gave a little bit of lip service and did their own thing. And maybe their thing is the right thing. I don't think it is, but maybe it is. I'm not really trying to make that argument now. But within Hinduism, you have the oldest continually practiced religion in the world because they never stop practicing it. And that means that Hindu pundits take the time to trace out where their ritual comes from, where their practice comes from, where their philosophy comes from. So it's not that bhakti and a personal deity wasn't in the Upanishads. It just wasn't in your face. And the Gita really put it front and center and made it undeniable. Of course, 500 million people don't understand the Gita, even though they revere it. So it's not like just because the Gita was super clear about it that automatically now everybody's become a Vaishnava. And so there's all sorts of misunderstandings about what Krishna says, even though he couldn't be more clear. Yeah. Yell at me.
So was there...
Tadeo, where you been, man? I've been missing you.
Been missing you guys too, Prabhu. I was in Brazil for 3 weeks.
They don't have telephones in Brazil or Wi-Fi.
They do, in a very different time zone.
Got you. How many hours ahead are you? In Brazil, how many hours ahead were you?
4.
That's a legitimate excuse. I was getting my feelings hurt. I was wondering, did I offend Tadeo? I was thinking that this week I got to call him up, see what I did wrong. I value coming to these classes so much. I value your input so much. I notice every week you don't show up, and it was bumming me out. So it's really nice to have you back, and it's even nicer to know that I didn't offend you and you just didn't get over it. You were actually out of station. Yell at me, Kat.
So was there a rampant impersonalism going on?
Did you hear that question, Tadeo? Okay. It's hard to know what exactly was going on thousands of years ago in India in philosophical circles. It's tough to know. The bhakti cult was not in full effect the way it became in full effect. I mean, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and the Alwars in South India, there were bhakti, revolutions, or what do I want to call them, renaissances that took place 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago. So the bhakti renaissances of medieval India are well attested to in literature and in coins and in art, in temples, in iconography. With text it's not so easy because the texts are written on paper, or they're written on a papyrus or whatever, like some type of parchment, and they don't last forever. But you'll get inscriptions in stone. You get numismatic evidence, coins. You got that Megasthenes, the Greek ambassador to India, who 5 centuries before the Common Era, so this is around the time of Buddha, erected a column. It was like a thing you used to do, in a lot of ways it seems a bit like a phallic symbol, but you would erect a column. You would build a big pillar as a symbol of your devotion and inscribe it with some writing at the bottom. And so Megasthenes, he did that. He also glorified the Bhagavats. And the Bhagavats are the followers of Bhagavad, which would be devotees. So there were devotional cults and a bhakti thing going on, and there was the Chaturvyuha, these different iterations of Narayan, and there was a Bhagavat cult. This stuff existed. But it certainly was not concretized and as in your face in the earlier Vedic texts as it is in the Gita. Now we'll say, yeah, we were just really dumb, and so eventually they had to spell it out, and the smarter guys in the days of yore were able to understand it, even though it was a bit more cryptic. And maybe it was written in such a way to have a double and triple entendre and be able to be read in a number of different ways depending on what you were into. And so you were trying not to alienate anybody. The yogis and the Sankhyas, the followers of Sankhya and yoga, fought there. That's attested to in the Mahabharata, that those are 2 competing schools. You find Krishna honoring that and arguing why yoga and Sankhya are one. in like the 5th chapter of the Gita, for instance. And so that he's reconciling a debate which existed at the time of the Mahabharata. So there's stuff like that where you can point to it and be like, hey, that makes sense. You have free borrowing from earlier traditions. So Sankhya, the basic distinction between the body and the soul, is the skeleton of all Vedic, Indic philosophy. And so all the schools borrow from this idea that there's a soul and a body. And, which makes sense. It's a spiritual philosophy, basic principle. Yoga is adopted by most schools as a way to focus the mind and meditate. Nyaya, or logic, which is its own school, was then adopted as a way to argue and debate. And so you have this cross-pollination that exists in India where people it wasn't like the Middle East. In the Middle East, it's us versus them. You're a bunch of Bedouins, like fighting over oases in the desert, literally. And so the philosophy that rises out of that place is God-forsaken place with its insane heat and its rich supplies of oil. Prior to, nobody cared about the Middle East except for people from the Middle East, the ones who weren't trying to get out of there. I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but the Middle East was like just nothing. And then they discovered oil, and now all of a sudden it's like the center of the universe. And now everybody loves it. But in the Middle East, the resources are extremely scarce. The terrain is extremely inhospitable, to use a word. And Peyton's moving out of her place, breaking her lease a little early. And so she wrote, this place is inhospitable, which is a legal term because you can't have somebody lease a place from you if it's inhospitable. So she injected that in there. So I just figured I would use it today as well. It's a very foreboding, chunk of the world. It's relatively small. It's funny when you think about it. 5 billion, the religion of 5 billion people comes out of this little tiny desert in the middle of nowhere through Christianity and Islam. It's like Middle Eastern religion. Super dualistic, God and the devil, good and evil, heaven and hell, us versus them, Christians and heathens, Muslims and infidels. And so that, from a sociological point of view, their philosophy works really well with their environmental situation, where they're fighting over scarce resources with warring tribes. And so it's a very tribal philosophy. Dualistic, us versus them. India wasn't like that. India was a great civilization. There was no slavery in India. There was indentured servitude, but no slavery. The Muslims imported the first slaves in India from Ethiopia, who then eventually took over and killed their masters, and they became the rulers of India for a hot minute. The Abyssinians. You can look it up, Google it. I do a little better. I got Nick and Narayan like looking to knock me off my perch with their big history degrees. But this particular one I know a bit about. I'm a little more brushed up on Indian history than I am on like Civil War stuff. I don't go and stand out in a field like Narayan dressed up as a Confederate soldier and reenact with live action role playing games. I'm just kidding. I know you don't do that. I apologize for memorializing this on tape forever. So yeah, it was a great culture, and people got along, and they cross-pollinated. And so when you wanted to argue with a philosophical school, you wouldn't say everything you say is of the devil. You would say, well, we like point A, point B. Ooh, point C, we're making that our own. And then point D is where you got it wrong. And let's write a couple of books about point D. We'll get into that one. But A and B, we don't have a problem with, and C, we actually make our own. So every school used yoga. Every school used Nyaya. Yoga was their practice, Nyaya was their logic. Every school used Sankhya. It was their philosophical skeleton that they built their philosophy on. There are exceptions. There were atheistic philosophies, like Charvak. There were atheist philosophers in India at that time, and so they obviously would not follow the Sankhya tradition. But you find all of these schools which fought with each other and vied for control of the Indian spiritual landscape and the Indian philosophical landscape, which were one and the same. There was no separation of church and state. You find that those schools borrowed from each other. I mean, if you look at Buddhism, like the entire thing was ripped off from Christianity, or from Hinduism. They still critique Hinduism. It's not like they just ripped it off and then gave it a new name. They have a critique. They make an argument against Hinduism, but they also borrow tons of terminology. I mean, the Dhammapada has a chapter, the last chapter of the Dhammapada, a standard Buddhist text, not the earliest Buddhist text, but a very standard Buddhist text, is who's a Brahmin? Who's the real Brahmin? Oh, you guys think you're Brahmins? We're the real Brahmins. The Buddhists, the Bauddhas, followers of Buddha, they're the real Brahmins. So they were, imagine if like the Bible had a chapter called Who's the Real Jew? Do you follow? It's like, it's bold. And the I don't know. I don't know if plagiarism is the right word, but the borrowing and the cross-pollination and the indebtedness to the pre-existing parent tradition is just undeniable. It's just, you just have to look at it. So, was everybody an impersonalist? No. Were there Bhagavats? Yes. Were they as prominent as they were after the Gita? Probably not. But I mean, all of ours made it prominent again. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu made it prominent again. Yeah, there's always these bhakti renaissances going on at various points, at various places, where people become intensely devotional. And for Hindus, because we're the oldest continually practiced religion in the world, what we do is we do kind of what the Christians do, but perhaps we do it a little better. We trace back our tradition to the earlier precursor. And our argument isn't they got it wrong and we got it right. Our argument is we're now explicating what they said a little more cryptically. Therefore, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu discovered the Brahma Samhita. It's an old Samhita. It's the oldest stratum of Vedic literature. The original Samhita, the oldest Vedic text in the world. It's the Brahma Samhita. And what does it teach you? To worship Krishna. Ecstatically, in the mood of a gopi. He discovered that, popularized that, this ancient text. And that's you get the philosophical implication. Whether he wrote it himself or he actually discovered it, it's a core text of our tradition. And it's a Samhita, proving that what we're doing is the oldest thing. We learn verses from the Upanishads. Verses from the Upanishads are included in the Gita. They're included in the Bhagavatam. Because we're building on the work of our predecessors instead of starting from scratch. Just like when you become a fireman, there's a number of hacks that you learn, right? Like dozens of hacks. Like there's like they actually number them, right? Like number 1 through 20. They're lessons you learn. And you have to know them. And like they'll ask you a question, you have to know them by memory, right? Because some firemen like died. The 10s and 18s. So there's a bunch of firemen who died. And the lessons of their death are a set of rules that all firemen follow to not then die again. And it's like it's understood to be a sacred thing. Then you have to know them in order to be considered to be legitimate. welcome to any special interest group, including a religion. There's certain stuff that's like that's what makes us who we are, that we all agree on this stuff. And so for Hindus, it's not just your fidelity to the Gita. For a pundit, it's your ability to demonstrate that the Gita is correctly teaching what came before it. I don't normally get a chance to do this dance with you guys because you don't know the pre-existing tradition. So there's no utility in me outlining how to make an argument that we're connected to the pre-existing tradition. The only time I get to argue like this is if I'm talking to a South Indian Brahmin or something like that, or a Nambudiri Brahmin or something like that, some kind of old school Vedic pundit who then critiques us for worshiping Radha, for chanting Hare Krishna, for different things that we do, and tries to say there's an older system in place. And then we demonstrate that we are still following that older system, and the nuanced differences between our school and their school don't represent a change in the philosophical idea. They rather represent an evolution of it, and we actually understand their tradition better than they do, and we're doing a better job of following, and we've dealt with things that they didn't deal with, and then we find little bits and pieces of their older tradition, and we say, see, you missed it. You didn't know what that was. We know what that is. We can actually deal with that. You can't deal with that. That was a little breadcrumb left by your guru. You all missed it. We got it. But that's why we're the oldest continually practiced religion in the world. And you see here in this verse, Krishna essentially making the argument I just made over the last 30 minutes. By all the Vedas I'm to be known, I made the Vedas, I know the Vedas. The Vedas are about me. You get it? That's what Krishna's saying. The Vedas are about me. And then the next 5 verses are super pregnant. Dvav imal prushal loke kshar akshar evacha kshar sarvani bhutani kutasta akshar uchate. There are 2 types of people in this world: fallen and liberated. Everybody's fallen, and one who's reached the zenith of spiritual perfection is liberated. Uttama Purusha tu anya Paramatma iti udahrita lo yolokatrayam avisha vibharti avyam ishwaram. The inexhaustible Lord, the Supreme Being, is different than both the liberated and non-liberated person. He's entered into the world. He's maintaining the world. Yasmakshar titoham akshat apichotama yoloke vedecha pratita purushotama. Because I am beyond liberated and fallen souls, I'm celebrated in this world and in the Vedas as the Supreme Being. Atu asmi loke vedecha. Because therefore I am known in this world and the Vedas. Celebrated, pratita, celebrated as Purushottam, the Supreme Being. Purusha Uttama, Supreme Person. That's what Purushottam means. Purusha Uttama, Supreme Being. I am the Supreme Being because I've made the world and am maintaining it. I'm different than any other living entity, including a fully self-realized soul. Yo mamevama samudho janati purushottama. If you know me as the Supreme Being, sasarva, that you know everything. Bhajati mam sarva bhavena, you worship me with all your heart. Bhajati mam, you worship me. That's where you get the word bhakti from. Sarva bhavena, with all your heart. See what Krishna just did there? He said he knows the Vedas, he made the Vedas are about him, and now he's giving you the essence of the Vedas. What's the essence of the Vedas? There's souls in this world. Some of them are self-realized, some of them aren't. None of them are God. God is categorically different than all souls. Why? Because he made the universe. And he's maintaining the universe. And nobody else is doing that. Therefore, he's known in a different way than everybody else. He's known as Paramatma, as Purushottam, as the Supreme Being, as the Supreme Soul. But then he repeats it, because I'm beyond both the liberated and non-liberated beings. And that's why I'm known this way. And if you know me, if you know that God exists and is the Supreme Being, if you don't have an impersonal conception, if you don't have a fuzzy conception, if you become a Vaishnava, if you understand that there is a source of everything and that source is personal, and that you can love that source and have a reciprocal relationship with that source, then the result of that is that you know everything. And we know that you know everything when you start worshiping Krishna with your whole heart. Iti guhyatamam shastram. This is the greatest secret of all scriptures. This is the greatest secret of all scriptures. Idam uktam mayanaga. And I've explained this to you. This has been explained by me to you. Etat budva buddhiman syat. And if you understand this, then you will become the most intelligent. Krita kritya, and all your endeavors will become complete. So what you have here is Krishna trying to argue that what he's explaining here is what the Vedas have all taught. And he's now given it to you in a quick 5 verses. And the essential thing he chooses to teach in those quick 5 verses is the difference between personalism and impersonalism, the superiority of personalism, the specific name for a personal deity, and the result of having understood philosophically these points, theologically these points, is that you become a bhakta. There is no section of the Gita where this argument is made more succinctly, more powerfully, more straightforwardly than these 5 verses. Every devotee should memorize them. You want to go for extra credit, we can find bhakti in the Upanishads. But at least we should be able to demonstrate bhakti in the Gita. And the introduction Krishna gives, I'm teaching you, this is like, I know all the Vedas, I made all the Vedas are all about me. And now, listen to what I have to say. Listen to me drop some Vedic wisdom on you. So, you find new religions. They're just like, we're doing our own thing. Like Joanne woke up, had a dream about the giant Smurf in the sky. Now we're all Smurfettes, and we worship, a deity of like a Smurf deity. And that's just what it is, which really isn't that much different than us. We also worship little blue people, so a little blue person, so, it's not so far off. You got we're just starting from scratch. You follow? And the other option is we come in a tradition, and our bona fides are that we are properly following that tradition. It doesn't indicate that you're speaking truth. There's all sorts of terrible traditions out there. Slavery is a really time-honored tradition that was around for a long time and all over the world in diverse cultures. And so nobody's thinking, wow, that means slavery is legit. This Muslim apologist I was talking to today had to run from the Islamic occupation of India. They weren't sincere enough to go, I'm sorry, I'd like to be your ally. They had to just, run from it, try and blame somebody else. It's funny, when you mess with somebody's sacred cow, they drop being an ally real quick can get all fundamentalist on you, fanatic. Anyway, so sometimes you start from scratch. Sometimes you connect yourself to something else. If you connect yourself to something else, it doesn't mean you can just say any damn stupid thing because people have been saying it for a long time. You still have to make sense. Preaching in India is so easy. Just like yell Bhagavad Gita shlokas at people and everybody's happy. Kind of like what Christians do here. Do you accept Jesus? Jesus said, "I'm the way, the truth, and light. No one's back to the Father except through me." You're like, okay, I'll become a Christian. That's a great argument. People are raised on it. So then when they get drunk and decide they want to get sober or they get to have a bad breakup, they end up going to church and becoming a Jesus freak. It's easy. It's like low-hanging fruit. You want to convince somebody to Hare Krishna in the U.S. It's a whole different ballgame. You know? We're different enough that it's a lot of cultural capital to become one of us. You got to really give up your identity. And then we're also not just vague. We're not just cool. Everything's groovy and it's just all about being open and listening to your heart and catching the vibe and feeling compassion and having universal love and really getting the essence of all things and just, discovering, the true light and the true path. It's not that. We don't say that. We're like, Krishna's God, you're his eternal servant, worship deities, shave your head maybe, wear a sari, chant japa every day, take lifelong vows. You know what I mean? We're like, so on one hand, we're exotic enough that nobody just wakes up and is like, I'm going to be a Hare Krishna because I decided to stop drinking and that's where I'm going to go. And then at the same time, we're not just mellow enough where we can win a bunch of 20, 30-something-year-olds who are in Buddhism or something like that. We've got this super definitive conception of God, and it's incredibly uncomfortable and challenging for people. And so we have to actually explain stuff to people. The fact that we're part of a tradition at least demonstrates that we're not just making stuff up. Also, being part of a tradition is great because super smart people answered a lot of the questions that you wouldn't have time to figure out in your own life because you're not that smart. And you get to just you get a book of just epic answers to every question you could ever ask. It's like you buy a new car and you get the manual with the car and it answers tons of questions. I mean, those manuals are phenomenal. They tell you all sorts of stuff. So there's great things about being part of a tradition. When you have questions, there's really good answers by super smart people, and they've connected it to your sacred tradition. They've been answering those questions for hundreds of thousands of years, and they really know what they're talking about. They've also, ideally, tons of people have walked that path and left their footnotes. And so as you're starting to walk your own path, they can give you great advice and help you hack through it all and move a lot quicker. And there's a little bit of a sense of belonging to something bigger than yourself, and there's a group of people. There's a lot of great stuff, but none of it stops you from having to actually be able to answer the questions of life and make a cogent argument. So Krishna just says it. I am God, but there's actually an argument here. There is a creator of everything which exists. The creation includes individual souls. Therefore, the creator of everything which exists also created individual souls. Therefore, that creator must be the supreme soul, the supreme being. Because otherwise, where did all the other beings come from? Well, you're just temporarily an individual being. Eventually, you'll merge into the white light. That's the goal, to get back to the light. But if the goal is to get back to the light, get back to a oneness with God, where you're no longer a person, then you have to ask the question, the obvious question, the question that Nick knows I'm about to say. What's the question?
Where did the variety come from?
Why did we ever become individuals even in an illusory capacity? If ultimately everything is one, and we're trying to get back home to where everything is one, and there's no individuality, then where did the individuality initially come from? Well, it's just an illusion. Okay, where did the illusion of individuality initially come from? Well, it must have come from the one, because the one is the source of everything. Now the one all of a sudden has individuality. It's all of a sudden two. There's the one with the illusion of individuality, and there's the one without the illusion of individuality. You follow? And this one, the illusion of individuality must come first, because this would be a subset of that one, because this one has something the other one doesn't have. So now you're saying that the illusion of individuality is somehow that topmost thing that's ever existed. Do you guys follow that? Which, of course, just makes no sense. And so an impersonal conception of God does not account for the existence of a world with individuals. Whereas a personal conception of God does account for a world with individuals in it. And so Krishna's argument, it's actually encoded there in his statement. There's different types of souls in this world. Some are liberated, some are not. Right? But there's different types of individual souls. And then there's one soul who created everything. The individual souls, liberated or not, didn't create everything. They just woke up and they were here. But there's a creator and maintainer of everything. And that creator maintainer is the ultimate soul, the supreme soul, the highest soul, the most perfect soul, the original soul, the best soul, the over soul, the super soul. Did you guys follow this? It's actually a logical argument. It's actually a logical argument. Do you guys follow that? Now you ready for extra credit? There's a verse in the Upanishads. Nityo nityanam chaitanas chaitananam. This is from the Katha Upanishad. I just want to make sure the reference. Nityo nityanam chaitanas chaitananam eko bahunam yo vedadhati kaman. Nityo. Nitya nityanam. Eternal amongst the eternals. Chaitana chaitananam. Conscious amongst the conscious. Eko bahunam. One amongst the many. Ya vidadhati kaman. And that one is fulfilling, that person, that being is fulfilling the desires of everyone else. The Katha Upanishad is one of the oldest Upanishads. It's arguably the oldest Upanishad. It's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, esoteric philosophical texts in Hinduism. It's quoted in the Gita. And this is a verse from it. Nityo nityanam chaitanas chaitananam eko bahunam yo vidadhati kaman. There's one being amongst the many. One conscious being amongst the conscious. One eternal being amongst the eternals. And that being is fulfilling the desires of everyone else. Do you follow this? There's the same argument. If there's many conscious beings, their source must be consciousness. A one conscious being. If there's a bunch of individual conscious beings, there must be one conscious being that's their source. If there's many beings, there must be one being that came before them. If there's many eternal truths, there must be one eternal ring that rules them all. And one is fulfilling the desires of the other. And so you find the same argument being made in the old Upanishads. It's the same argument that Krishna is making here. Thousands of years prior. It's the same message. It's not a new message. Krishna is just making it absolutely undeniable. In fact, what are we doing today? We're making it impossible to escape Krishna's argument. Krishna made it impossible to escape the Upanishads' arguments. And the Upanishads themselves made the same argument. It was just a little more sophisticated. It was one verse instead of 6, instead of an hour-long class. But it's the same idea, that you're unpacking what was already there. It's just people don't have the eyes to see it. And so for every generation, there's work to explain it, to make it make sense, to make it click. Do you guys follow that? That was like the little hammer drop moment. Did you guys get it? So there's nothing wrong with new religion, Islam. Nothing wrong with that. Cool. No sweat. Has a lot in common with the other tribal religions from the Middle East. Somehow they're insanely popular. I can't figure it out, but what do I know? Just a Hare Krishna. And so, I get fanatical thinking and absolute certitude. I mean, there's some stuff they got going for them. Violence, there's warmongering, eternal hell. They got fear-mongering. They got some stuff going for them. It's like low-level moral arguments. Kind of an argumentum ad baculum. The argument with a stick. With the argument for, with violence. The Quran in one hand and the sword in the other. And then you got religions like Buddhism that really go in a different direction, but borrow freely from the pre-existing traditions. Then Islam kind of does lip service, doesn't really borrow. Then some religions just grow up out of nowhere, do their own thing. And then some traditions say they're connected to the older stuff, like Wiccans and this kind of neo-Egyptian religion, real popular amongst African American people. At least it was, like in the 70s or 80s. Although the Egyptians owned slaves and were super cruel to the Nubians. And how do you know that? From looking at the hieroglyphics. They had white hieroglyphics, they had red hieroglyphics, they had tan hieroglyphics, and they had black hieroglyphics. And they showed themselves winning over the black hieroglyphics because they fought the people from Lower Egypt, which was, or maybe Upper Egypt, the upper part of the Egyptian Empire, which was down south and was known as Nubia. Now there were some black Egyptian rulers at various points, so it's not the black Nubian people never seized power and took over the Egyptian kingdom. It did happen, but this idea that Egyptian people were black or that they didn't own slaves or that they weren't subjugating people is ridiculous. Although the whole idea that they had a bunch of Jewish slaves is probably not true. They were probably more like hired laborers. It doesn't seem like they were building the pyramids with slaves, despite the fact that totally kills the Jewish narrative from Exodus. That's what the evidence seems to suggest when you actually get into it. But yeah, you get these people like a neo-Egyptian religion, but nobody knows what the Egyptian religion was. They just read a few texts with crappy translations and, get angry at anybody tells them they're wrong, and they just make some stuff up. Really, it's just some dude from the 70s. You get a bunch of white guys on mescaline and peyote trying to tell you what the Native Americans practice. You don't know if it's true or not. The Rainbow Warriors, you don't know if that's true or not. It certainly does not sound like something that, like Sitting Bull was talking about, Certainly does not sound like something Geronimo was talking about, you know what I mean? Like we're all Rainbow Warriors. It doesn't seem like it, And so you do get some books written by Indians, from Native Americans, who then became a part of Western culture and at the end of their life wrote about their childhood. So you do get accounts, from 150 years ago of people who were trying to keep the traditions alive. It's just generally not the Rainbow Warrior dudes from the 70s, the kind of hippies, agro-hippies from the 70s. They're generally not the guys who are the holders of that tradition. And so and the Wiccan people are trying to represent Druidism and pagan religions. They're not. They're just making stuff up. Maybe get a few things. You get these neo-pagans, like aggro Norwegian guys from Norway, European guys. They because they usually have they actually know the language a little bit. They can go back a little bit to the old Nordic language. They do a little better job, but they're also making stuff up, doing new stuff, figuring it out, writing new myths, making it happen. But Hinduism is legitimately the oldest practiced religion in the world. It's something special. We get to say this is something special about us. We don't have to yes, all religions teach the same thing and all this and that, and there's something special about our tribe, and here's something special. But just saying we're the oldest continually practiced religion in the world doesn't mean that you don't have to actually prove it. You have to demonstrate it. And you have to make sense. You have to put together cogent arguments. You have to make sense to the next generation of people. And then they get to be like, wow, that makes sense. And you guys have been doing this forever? That's extra cool. If you guys were doing slavery forever, you guys sucked forever. You were idiots forever. But if you guys were doing this stuff forever, and you just explained it and it made sense to me today in 2021, now I look back and I go, wow, those are my people. That's my tribe. We still got to make sense. Every generation. You still got to show that you're representing, that you are representing. Then the old tradition thing is cool. Otherwise, it's lip service or new wine in an old bottle, which is what a lot of these traditions are. Or you're just doing your own thing. And Christianity, the way it looks now, I remember seeing, they had like a picture of Jesus. Jesus is a Jew. He was like, they had to pay us or whatever, and he was hanging out as a Jew. And then they said, some Christian priest was saying, you are the hypostatic union, fully human and fully divine. You are one of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. You've come in this world to wash the sins of man away with your blood. And they're pontificating about all the things that Christians think about Jesus. And then Jesus, it's a cartoon I read. Jesus in the next frame goes, huh? It's the Jew, Like they got this whole religion out of him, but it's not necessarily what he was teaching. It really seems like Jesus' early followers were a bunch of Jews who told, you didn't have to circumcise yourself if you converted in adulthood. That's written down. That's in the New Testament. Because that would be kind of rough. That's definitely a barrier to entry, right? I'm really liking what you guys are doing. I want to convert. And they're like, you have to chop off part of your genital. You're like, I think I'm going to call this a miss. I'm just going to go back to paganism. Sounds really weird. It's like not like you had me at hello. It's like you lost me at chop off part of my genital. So they put in rules. You don't have to do that. But they had all these Mosaic rules you had to follow. No strangled animals, no pagan altar, no fornicating outside the marriage. They had like a bunch of rules. Like all taken from they were really trying to keep it connected. They're not like us. We're on another level of connected. There might be some philosophical, theological connections. Our connections are just across the board. That's why we get that honor. That's why Christianity and Judaism are studied as two different subjects. Although they did cross-pollinate, although one came from the other, although you can find connections, it's not like us. Not like what I just did for you guys. And anyway, last point I'll make. When you convince somebody that you are following that old tradition, that you are correctly interpreting it, they become a member of your tribe and they feel like they're fulfilling that. All Christians think they're the best Jews ever. There's a whole Jews killed Jesus thing. You guys know this? It's a massive movement in history that gave rise to Hitler and all sorts of people before him, going back to the Middle Ages. But there's this idea that the Jews killed Jesus, and that the Jews are actually like the worst people in the world because they didn't recognize Jesus, and now we got to wipe out the Jews with pogroms and with crusades and with different types of genocide because they are the antithesis of what we stand for as Christians. So that happens sometimes where you actually begin to revile your parent culture. That's a problem. And you think you're fulfilling it, but then you think the original people are terrible. And when you talk to Jews, they think like these whole Christians, they don't understand anything. Like they have the Old Testament, it bears no resemblance to the Torah. They have no idea what they're doing. Their whole thing is corrupt. They make no sense. They got no clue what's going on. Someone one time told me, Tukram, you're corrupt. Your whole program is corrupt. It's this New York guy. He's trying to rise up on me. This is like 20 years ago. And so, that's kind of how the Christians feel about the Jews. It's also how the Jews feel about the Christians. But, I like to think that if the Hindus of yesteryear were to look at what we're doing now, they'd be like, wow, you guys got it. Like, you're doing kirtan all the time? You're following all these rules? And everybody else has lost their head? Those are the 4 rules you follow? You're worshiping deities? Like that? You're doing Achman and Arti and all that? Like, wow. That's amazing. Oh, you've got like batik printing now? Wow, that's kind of cool. You've got some new things that are different than the ikat work we were doing. You've got some new ways of dyeing cloth and new ways of dressing the deity, and you made these crystal things where we actually get real gems. they give you just as much glitter, but they you don't have to like fight wars over them and have a guard standing over the deity so people won't steal the gems from the deity. I think they would appreciate the new things we're doing and see that we did not change the actual culture. All right. Thank you guys, Naji TV.